to hit the record button. All right, very good. So if you don't want your image used, this will go up on YouTube. So if you don't want your image used in that, you can just keep your camera off. All right, so when in this session tonight, we're going to examine the objectives of a listening lesson. What do we want our students to actually be able to do in terms of listening? We'll talk about the challenges of a listening lesson. They are, I don't know if there are many, but they are strong. We'll also do a sample lesson where you will be the students. And then discuss best practices. And then at the end, we'll just finish up with some listening resources that are readily available. Before we get going though, as you know, I often like to start with kind of a warm-up discussion. So I'd like to know more about how you all teach listening here. Is it a class that you devote to listening? Are there certain things you focus on? In your textbooks, are there listening exercises? Is it done through technology, or do you read scripts? Just basically, what is the situation with listening in your classrooms? You can answer in the chat, or you can raise your hand to speak. Go ahead, Kari. Oh, you are muted. There you go.
Okay. Yes. Hello, everyone. Okay, I would like to tackle that question you have asked about how do I teach listening? Okay, in our textbooks, there are exercises on that. And how I teach listening, maybe sometimes I go with a short story in the classroom or a written journal in the classroom. Then I dictate to them. Then they write on their books or in their books. So by that, you can be able to assess how are they keen in listening what you're teaching, or so you may collect the book, you go and mark, or maybe you can tell the student to interchange the books to mark for themselves. So the ones that are difficult, they have difficulties in some ones, you can write them on the board so that those who didn't write well, they can write them well. That is how I teach and assess listening. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very clear explanation. So my understanding is that you often read a story from the textbook and then you dictate that the students write down what you say. And then from that, common errors you put up on the board so that it's clear to everyone. Very good. All right, in the chat, we have some other things. So Anne says using exercises in the textbooks. Celestine seems to be saying something similar to what you were telling us, Kari. Most listening lessons, we read a paragraph or a story, they listen, and then we ask questions. Okay, so rather than dictation, she's using comprehension questions. Isaac says, I teach listening to reading short scripts and then ask questions. Very good. All right, so it sounds like for a lot of these listenings, the students, okay, Patricia is saying different. I was about to say, it sounds like students are listening to the teacher, but here Patricia says students listen to an audio and then answer written questions. Okay, so they are using audio. Good to know. Okay. All right, so when we're talking about objectives, many teachers, when they're writing their objectives, use this kind of STEM. Students will be able to. I like using it myself. It ensures a student-centered lesson and provides something for us to assess. So at the end of the class, students will be able to do whatever it is that we complete this sentence with. So it makes a nice specific objective that is measurable, and we can assess the success of the lesson. So when we're looking at listening, basically we have 4 types of listening. They are intensive, responsive, selective, and extensive. And it is not necessary for you to know these things. In fact, I spent most of my teaching career not knowing that these were the names for the type of listening. I think as teachers, we all kind of know that there's different levels of listening. It's not so important to know the names, but I provided them here. So intensive listening would be our most basic type of listening, where we have to recognize phonemes or sounds. We need to be, for example, even with very beginners, they need to be able to distinguish between the letter A or B, something like this. They need to also be able to distinguish words, grammar structures, discourse markers, such as but, and, things like that. Finally, and then also intonation, because that gives us a lot of information. Before I go any further, Yvette is saying that she teaches listening through reading, books, short stories, and also listening to audio, so a mix. So this first type, this intensive listening, students need to be able to do this to some degree of success in order to do any other type of listening. So this is the very basics of listening. The next step up is responsive, and this is a specific type of listening. For example, we might be able to do the other types, selective or extensive, without doing responsive, but all of these other types require this ability to do intensive listening. Responsive listening is what it sounds like, basically being able to understand what we're hearing in order to make a short response. So in order to do this, students need to be able to identify the speech event, the context, and the content. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Selective listening is a higher level listening. This is a longer listening, something like a monologue, an announcement, a speech, a lecture. And so they need to scan these longer stretches of content to listen for specific information. We often think about reading a text and scanning, but this is something we also use in listening. And then finally, extensive listening is probably our highest level listening, our most challenging, which makes sense. Extensive, it sounds broad. So this involves being able to comprehend longer stretches of speech, again, so probably lectures, announcements, maybe movies, even radio, for general information, and being able to determine and retain relevant information. And we'll look more specifically at what that means. But that might be something like listening to a lecture and being able to keep some of that information. All right, so when we are looking at this intensive level of language, which is recognizing phonemes, words, grammar structures, discourse markers, and intonation. So we might have a task, for example, like this. Students might hear at a very basic level, they might hear, for example, the word book, and then they see 2 pictures and they have to determine which is book, right? So they need to be able to hear and comprehend this word or phoneme. Also intensive listening, but perhaps a little bit easier, but harder, sorry, it's a full sentence. A student hears, I can't go to the party, and they need to determine which sentence is the one they heard, so they would have to identify that can't. Or they might be able to do this instead through intonation. I can go to the party versus I can't go to the party. There would be a different intonation to it as well. So this might be phonemic, or it might be with the intonation. And this can get more complicated as well. So they might hear a full sentence and then not necessarily just identify exactly what they hear, but show some degree of comprehension as well. So the student hears, hi, my name is Amy, I come from France. And then the student has to decide which sentence means the same thing as what they heard. And hopefully they would determine Amy is French since Amy comes from France. These are all examples of intensive listening as a very basic type of listening. If learners can't do these basic things, they really can't do other higher level types of listening. But certainly this isn't the only thing that learners need to be able to do in order to listen effectively or successfully. So next, we're looking at responsive listening. Responsive listening is what we need to do in order to interact with others or to have a conversation. And so there's many things we have to do in order to be successful with responsive listening. So we have to do all the things we did in intensive listening, be able to discriminate sounds, intonation, words, but we also have to understand some other things. So we need to understand what the speech event is. If somebody is talking to us, we need to understand, are they asking me a question? Are they telling me something important? Do I even need to respond? Or maybe I don't need to respond. So this is the first thing they have to determine. If they're listening to like an audio, they'll need to understand who these speakers are, who is speaking, what is the relationship between the speakers. And then the content, actually, what is the speaker saying? So what would be an appropriate way to respond? So if we were doing some sort of task with this, the student might hear something like, what time did you get up today? And then the student would have to choose the appropriate response. So they have to understand that there's a question that needs an answer, that the person is talking to them, and then what type of answer would be most appropriate. And hopefully they would choose A, I woke up at 7. It doesn't have to be multiple choice, right? We could do this where we ask a student. So if I said to Kari, what time did you get up today? And then she could either answer me or she could write. As actually, she just did a responsive task when I asked, what is your, actually, she did it through reading because I had the question written, but when I asked, how do you teach listening? And she responded. Or another example would be when we began and I asked Austin if he had anything to say, and then he responded by making a short announcement. So this is a very common everyday type of listening. If we're going to communicate in a lesson or in a language, we need to be able to do these things. The next two types of listening are also functional. So this is selective, where we need to scan a listening passage or a listening text and select specific information. So if we were having a test, this doesn't always need to be done with words, but for example, maybe students would see one of these pictures and they would hear this speech. Choose the correct picture. In my backyard, I have a bird feeder. Yesterday, there were 2 birds and a squirrel fighting for the last few seeds in the bird feeder. The squirrel was on top of the bird feeder, while the larger bird sat at the bottom of the feeder, screeching at the squirrel. The smaller bird was flying around the squirrel, trying to carry it away, or trying to scare it away, not carry it. The bird cannot carry the squirrel. So students don't need to necessarily understand every single word. They don't need to process it. They don't need to remember it for future use. They only need to kind of scan what they're listening for in order to match it to the picture. So they might scan, for example, the number of birds. There were 2 birds and a squirrel. And so actually, all the pictures have 2 birds and a squirrel, okay? The squirrel was on top of the bird feeder, and right there, right away, we have this, the squirrel's on top of the bird feeder. But if they missed that, there's some other information. The larger bird sat at the bottom of the feeder. So we see the larger bird at the bottom here, and the smaller bird was flying around. And so we have some different things that learners can scan for. We also might have this is kind of classic, where students hear some sort of a, announcement, and then they have to complete the blank. This is something we do in real life. If you were at a busy airport and you were trying to catch your connecting. Sorry, I'm hearing weird noises, which might be me. So students need to scan the information to listen for something specific. So the time of their flight and their gate number, something like this. Yeah, selective listening is very important. I don't know, I keep muting, but I don't know why I'm hearing these strange sounds.
Yeah, we are listening.
Oh, so, and sorry, Austin, I didn't mean to mute you too.
No, I'm just saying that we are listening to some strange noise
Yes, I don't know where it's
from your
coming.
device. Yeah,
Oh,
it's actually coming from your end.
No. Hopefully it will stop. Okay, it's distracting. Yeah, it's very very useful and something that's really necessary. Selective listening, I would say. I would say responsive and selective are two types of listening that we need to function in everyday life. And then finally, we have extensive listening. Extensive listening is used in everyday life, but we might often associate this with more academic goals in listening. So we have many different tasks that can go with this. Dictation would be one, because we need to listen and be able to write. Sometimes in dictation, we have dictations where students write exactly what they hear, but another type of dictation might have students paraphrase what they hear, which is actually more effective because if students are paraphrasing what they hear, it shows that they understand what they hear. If students are doing straight dictation, they don't necessarily understand the words they're hearing, but they're able to write them out. So for example, if you dictated to me in Swahili, I could write out what you were saying. I'd probably have some spelling mistakes, but it doesn't mean that I would understand what I'm writing. Another example would be a listening passage. Students listen to the passage and then after they have to answer some multiple choice questions. So here they have to understand general meaning. They have to decide what's important and keep it in their minds. Note-taking, I think, is a prime example. If a teacher is lecturing, students are deciding what to write down to keep for later. Editing is another task that isn't very commonly done. This would be an example where students have a text in front of them. They're also listening, but there are some differences between what they hear and what's written, and they have to edit the text in front of them to correct it. Interpreting and responding, so maybe students listen to, I don't know, for example, a radio article or a video about a news thing, and then they have to respond and give their own thoughts or ideas. And then finally, we have retelling or summarizing. So a lot of you mentioned reading stories. So you might have students either rewrite the story in their own words or tell it to a friend or to you, perhaps. These are all different examples that would employ extensive listening skills. They don't necessarily have to be high level though. This can also be done with lower level or even beginner students. So for example, students listen to a story and they have to draw 3 pictures. One shows what happens in the beginning of the story, the middle, and the end of the story. This would show that they were able to listen, determine the important information, and then kind of relay it in a way that didn't require language. So if their language level wasn't high enough for them to speak or to write. So it might be more fun. All right, we have challenges though. I mentioned 3 here, you probably have more. One is that listening lessons can become quite boring. Students can be very passive during listening because they're sitting and listening. And then sometimes they're writing something, but that's usually the only other thing that they're doing. And then often once is not enough, so they have to listen again. And so they end up just sitting still for a long time. Something else that's tricky is that listening is a receptive skill. It's not something that we can see or hear, unlike speaking or writing. And so we have to infer listening. All of the ways that we have for assessment are kind of a way for us to determine if they understood or not. So for example, with dictation, if they dictate exactly what they, or they write exactly what they hear, then we can guess that they can distinguish sounds and words, but we can't know that they understand. If we have them paraphrase, then we can infer or guess that they actually understand. So this takes us actually back to one of the issues we talked about in assessment when we're working with multiple choice, the problem with cheating. It may look like students have high listening ability, but actually they don't. So it can be very hard to find appropriate tasks for listening, or hard to create them as well. And also we want to make sure that we're actually assessing listening. So for example, if students are retelling a story, but they do it in writing, if it's full of grammar mistakes, well, that doesn't mean their listening is bad. It means that their writing is bad. And then finally, another challenge is it can be hard to find good resources. A lot of you mentioned having these stories in books, and that is valuable, but do think about your listening in life. In life, do you spend most of your time listening to stories, or are there other things that you listen to? And how can we replicate those situations so that your students are having authentic tasks and authentic materials for their listening, or as authentic as can be? And this can be really challenging. So I'll turn this back over to you. What other challenges do you experience in your classes with listening? Are these the only challenges? I'm guessing not. I'm guessing that there's other challenges out there as well. So please feel free to share in the chat or raise your hand and speak. I included these as they're probably my 3 biggest challenges with listening, especially number 1, but I could probably make a pretty long list, I think. Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, one of the challenges I think we face, especially in Kenya, with regards to teaching listening skills, is the different accents that our teachers have. So learners actually understanding exactly what the teacher is saying based on the accent makes it very, very tricky for the learner to actually understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. It makes me think of something else, Kari, is that I noticed from my own personal experience, my students would say, teacher, when we're in the class with you, we understand everything you say, but when we go outside in the world, at the time I was in the US, we can't understand what other people say. So students become tuned into one type of listening or one type of accent, but then they can't transfer their skills to other accents. That's a very good point. Kari says it only appeals to hearing sense, so it sides with one side of communication and leaves out the speaking part. Yeah, which is not natural, right? Usually listening involves speaking as well. Patricia says, in the Kenyan context, students struggle with understanding the accent. Yes, very good at reiterating what Nancy was saying. Lillian says, difficulty in understanding, especially the pronunciation, hence learners tend to shun from listening and they find it boring. Yes, it's challenging and frustrating, and then it can be boring as well. The concentration span, absolutely, yes, requiring them to concentrate and focus their brains. Outside distractions, oh, it's, yes, very easy to become distracted. The attitude of the learner towards the teacher, can, yes, prohibit them from focusing, and the difficulty in understanding. I agree. All right, I saw some hands up. Seth, I saw your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mina, I wanted to add on something on accent, or sometimes there are different levels of pronunciation also affect the level of comprehension. If it was something maybe the learners were listening to, maybe a storytelling, of which they will be required to paraphrase what they have heard and relate what they have heard with their experience or what they have read. Apart from that, sometimes if the learners, you want to teach them on listening from a comprehension, and you want them maybe to retell what they have heard, what they have read maybe, sometimes it may be difficult, especially when it was a comprehension probably that was quite long. The students might find it difficult to remember. And now if you were to judge them from the basis of the content they are to give back, then you will say that maybe they have poor listening skills. But sometimes when the content is too much, they may not remember a lot and they might be able just to bring out little. The other thing is vocabulary. Sometimes students might have limited vocabulary and the manner of expressing themselves, they understood actually, they listened carefully, but now their vocabulary is limited. So the level of communicating, maybe if they are to give a response, may be limited based on the vocabulary or the level of their vocabulary. That's what I wanted to add on, Mina.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you brought up some really good points, especially about assessment. Basically, if we were assessing learners with these issues, it may seem like they're not good listeners, but actually maybe it was too much to remember, or they do know, but they can't express it. Very good. Yeah, so we have to be very careful with our assessment. Thank you. Caroline, please share with us.
Hi guys. So I have a point I was thinking about. Maybe Mina, you can explain in short form what I will talk about. So you find that the teacher is reading out loud to the students so that they can develop this appreciation for literature. But at the end of the reading, the students decide to, okay, it's not the students' fault or anything, but you find that they've eluded the whole reading process. Either the reading was too long or something was amiss in the reading. So that makes them not concentrate, not be there at the moment throughout the literature reading. So I was looking for the short form of explaining that. Maybe, I don't know if you understood what I just said.
Yeah, basically, I think this goes to attention span, right? We're humans. And this happens often in reading, right? We're reading something and then we get to the bottom of the page and we realize, oh, I wasn't actually paying attention. I don't know what I just read. In reading, we can go back to the top and we can read it again. In listening, we can't do this. And when it's a long listening, it's going to happen. Yeah. Is that what you mean?
Okay. Okay, that could be a point, but I'm saying that the teacher is the one who's reading out loud to the classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the teacher reads, and then probably the literature is too long or too complicated for the students to understand. So in the process of reading all that, they tend not to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they get lost along the way somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be challenging, right?
Yeah. Do you ever try like stopping at certain points to kind of check in and make sure everybody is following?
Actually, it was just an idea that came into my mind because I have been there, you know, teacher reads, and then as a student, that is, and then you get lost, you know, you get lost along the way. You remember bits and pieces. So it gets a little bit hard to comprehend at the end of the reading session what it is.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think I think breaking up the reading would be a good idea. I think for the teacher too. I imagine the teacher gets tired of reading and reading and reading. So maybe stopping with some check-ins, some comprehension questions, maybe stopping and having students predict what's going to happen next might be some different ways to deal with that. I'll go back to the chat, and then Lauren, I'll call on you after that. Christine makes the point that it depends on how tired or fresh the learners feel. Yeah, I think our emotional state really affects our listening very much. I've noticed also, I think I mentioned before, IELTS testing. It's very high stakes testing. It's expensive. A lot depends on it. And they don't repeat the listening. It happens once. And I've seen students just freeze during the listening. Many of them have told me after like a minute or two, they are able to relax and then they're able to go from there, but that the first 10 questions they've missed because they're just so stressed. So those kinds of feelings really can impact, I think, listening. Nancy agrees. Oh, yeah. Anything after lunch can be very tiring. Yes, Nancy. Lillian says another one, the Kenyan examination is exam oriented, yet it does not consider listening as one of the aspects to be tested. Hence a casual approach to its listening or to its learning and teaching. That's very interesting. That's true. Teachers tend to focus on what's going to be examined and students tend to be motivated by those things. So this is kind of something that's not maybe given the attention that it needs. Oh, very good. Thank you for sharing that. Lorian, I saw your hand was up earlier. Will you share with us your thoughts?
Yes, I don't. First of all, thank you. And what I'm gonna share, I don't really have a specific term for it, but it's this tendency of a student who is listening and having, like, if you're listening to any listening material or a video or something like that, where there is a tendency of wanting to capture every meaning of what the speaker probably is saying. It happens mostly for the maybe A to B1 students. I usually see it, and when you give them present a kind of listening material, you don't know what kind of their listening style is, and you likely to find some are out of listening because they have this tendency of, like, you want to catch everything that a speaker is speaking. So I often find it a challenge to effective listening. I mean, to teaching listening effectively, even for the learners to have listening activities. Yeah, that's an idea, but I don't really know this specific term for it, how we can call it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. I think it's something that happens in reading as well. Students get frustrated because they don't understand every single word, when in fact, if they would just relax, even though they don't understand every single word, they would be able to get the main idea, but often they just get so stressed that and frustrated they can't access it. And yes, and then choosing a suitable material so that we can build confidence in our learners as well. I think that's an important aspect. Great. Austin says the British Council administers listening exams for their tests, unlike other systems of education, which I believe should also be done by the rest as it's one of the 4 language skills. Yeah, good point, Austin. It is tested like anything else. Yes. Yeah, if one were to take IELTS or TOEFL, which is kind of the American version, or any of those other proficiencies, if we look at British Council's band of A1, A2, listening is assessed just like anything else. Yeah, I think part of it is the maybe the issues of materials, the time that's involved in a listening lesson as well, maybe is part of it, or maybe it's just inferred. Lorian, is your hand still up or did you want to add something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add another thing
Uh-huh.
that I think might be another challenge, but this sounds like paradoxical because when you present in reasoning, there is another thing of culture hindrance to the reasoning, and I think if students are going to reason in any material, and then they don't understand the culture behind, I think this is not a challenge. It sounds paradoxical if one can teach you the culture before the reasoning or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, another one that also applies to reading. Much of these materials, especially if we're using authentic materials, requires cultural knowledge or some sort of background knowledge to make things more accessible. And so we definitely do need to set our students up beforehand. Good point. And we'll address this a little bit in the next part. All right, so next we're going to have kind of a sample lesson. You are now the students and I am the teacher. So good afternoon or good evening, students. I hope you're all doing well today. We're going to be listening to some news articles today. So before we get started, I'm going to give you a chance to warm up and talk about what's going on in the news today. And see if you can predict what stories are going to be in the news. And I will tell you, this is world news. So I don't know that we'll hear anything about Kenya or even East Africa. So I want you to be thinking about the world and what's going on there. In order to mimic the groups or pairs that I would have you be in if you were if we were really having class, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms, and I'm going to give you about 4 minutes in your breakout rooms to talk about what's happening in the news. See if you can predict what stories are going to be covered today. All right, so in your breakout room, there'll be about 3 to 4 people. So that everybody has a chance to talk. There won't be so many people. You'll be in there for 3 to 4 minutes and just kind of brainstorming what's going on in world news or international news today on May 3rd. All right, I'll open the rooms and I'll see you in about 4 minutes. I'll set my timer. right, I think everyone is returning from their breakout rooms. Go ahead, Seth.
Thank you, Mina. I was in room 3, and there are a few things we noted, probably just by guessing. Probably Ukraine-Russia war, that's likely to be on the headline. And then the more sanctions that are put on Russia based on the invasion in Ukraine. And then the visit by Pelosi, the speaker, to Ukraine. And he talked a bit of the US coming in to send some aid or financial support to Ukraine. And then a bit of the resurgence of COVID-19 in some few quarters. We have also heard about that. And then the escalation of the oil prices as a result of Russia-Ukraine war. Yeah, that's it.
Those are good guesses. Did any groups mention something that Seth didn't mention? So he mentioned several aspects of Ukraine and the Russian invasion, COVID, rising fuel prices. Anything totally different that anybody is predicting?
Group 7.
Go ahead, Carol.
We predicted the weather because especially in Africa, there are rain. So we predicted that could be news, world news.
Very good, yeah.
Yeah, there are rains, and we were suspecting that this could be covered in several other parts of the world. And especially the flooding in South Africa. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good guess too. Yeah, that's something that's constantly going on and has a big impact on people's lives. Good guess. Jeffrey, what else?
Hi, Mina.
Hi.
For us, I was in room 1. For us, we did sports. And then there's this team called Trabzonspor from Turkey. They just won the Turkish Super League for the first time since 1984. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, oftentimes sports does make world news. Very good. Celestine.
Okay, I was in group 2, and she basically predicted almost everything that they have said, but we also predicted on gender-based violence and how women continue to suffer under GBV in Africa and the world, like the case of Osinachi, who died due to the gender-based violence.
Good guess. Thank you. Yeah, that's something that is a world problem, right? And continues to affect people. Good guess. Francesca.
Okay, good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. I was in room 4. Yes, I was in 4. Hello?
Yeah, keep going.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, just continue,
Okay,
Francisca. We can hear you. Yeah, continue. We can hear you.
Okay, I was in room 4 and we discussed about the Eid celebration. I think that's the one that has not been mentioned. But for the others, they were the same.
Thanks for that, Francisco. So that's something else I wanted to remark is you are all doing a good job of listening to each other. So we'll take a break. Right now, you are not students, you are teachers. So I want you to notice that built into this activity, again, is already some listening, right? You have to listen to your peers because I'm looking for things that haven't been mentioned yet. So thank you for pointing that out. Very good. In the chat, I see some interesting things mentioned. Victoria's saying, yes, political issues we can always expect to be in the news. Nancy's been paying attention to the news. The White House Correspondents' Dinner was last night. Inflation, Christine, yes, it's something the entire world is dealing with, especially the energy crisis. Very good. So something specific about Russia and Ukraine, President Vladimir, yes, he's restricting his fuel to these unfriendly countries. The effects of the Russian-Ukraine war, as was mentioned. Leonard, yes, something else, the US may overturn abortion rights. Caroline, climatic changes and economic policies, specifically in Mongolia. Very good. And Seth reiterating what Leonard mentioned. Oh, on Thursday, voters in England, Wales, and Scotland will pick who they want to run local services. Oh, I did not know that. Oh, I'm learning a lot of news right now. All right, so you are students again. Students, we're going to go on to the next part. You did a good job predicting the news. You showed that even though you are students, you are very knowledgeable about what's going on in the world. All right, so we're going to listen to a brief news story from the BBC, and you have a task to do while you are listening. So I want to know how many news topics are covered in this and what countries are featured. So I'm not asking you to listen to the details of every story. I want to know how many news topics were featured and which countries were featured in this. Oops. Okay, we're going to listen now. Actually, I'm going to refresh this so that we have the most up-to-date news. I think this is the most up-to-date. Can you hear it? The music. Okay.
This is BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The headlines. Ukrainian soldiers say Russian troops are using planes, tanks and missiles fired from warships to attack the site of the besieged steelworks in Mariupol, where large numbers of Ukrainian civilians are still sheltering. The UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson tells Ukraine that it will win and be free in an address to the country's parliament, the first world leader to do so since the start of the war. Leaked documents suggest the US Supreme Court could overturn the nationwide legal right to abortion. If the court scraps the landmark Roe v. Wade ruling, abortion will instantly become illegal in 22 states. The Met Gala has returned to New York, and this year's theme was the Gilded Age. Celebrities showed off their lavish outfits for the annual fundraiser for New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. And they're all your latest headlines here on BBC World News.
Okay. So as my students, I would tell you to share with your partner how many news topics were covered and what countries were featured. I think, how many news stories were there?
4.
4, very good. And what countries did we hear about? Good. I see Russia, US, Ukraine. I think that's
UK.
it. Yes,
UK.
and UK. Very good, because we had Boris Johnson as well. Very good. There's a lot of US news for a British channel. Very good. All right, so we're going to listen again. And let's imagine that I'm giving you a worksheet, that you have this worksheet, passing it out to you. And there should actually be 4 topics, but on this paper, there's only 3. So you're just going to fill in this chart as you listen. You might be able to do it from memory. Where, so what country, when, everything was recent, but was it today? Was it yesterday? Was it last night? Who, if you can catch any names, and then briefly in the last box, what happened? So we're going to listen one more time. You can take notes if you like, since you don't have an actual worksheet.
This is BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The headlines. Ukrainian soldiers say Russian troops are using planes, tanks and missiles fired from warships to attack the site of the besieged steelworks in Mariupol, where large numbers of Ukrainian civilians are still sheltering. The UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson tells Ukraine that it will win and be free in an address to the country's parliament, the first world leader to do so since the start of the war. A leaked document suggests the US Supreme Court could overturn the nationwide legal right to abortion. If the court scraps the landmark Roe v. Wade ruling, abortion will instantly become illegal in 22 states. The Met Gala has returned to New York, and this year's theme was the Gilded Age. Celebrities showed off their lavish outfits for the annual fundraiser for New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. And they're all your latest headlines here on BBC World News.
Okay. All right, students, you're going to turn to your partner, compare your answers, see if you have similar or different answers. Okay. Imagine that happened. We're not really going to go over the answers. Very good, Lillian. So then I'm going to give you a piece of paper. I want you to choose one of the topics that we just heard about, and you are going to write a 2 to 4 sentence summary. You can use your chart here to help you write your summary, and make sure to use full sentences and correct punctuation. Don't worry, we're not really going to do any writing, but imagine as students, okay, you all did your writing, good job. I will collect your writing. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to get into groups, and you're going to discuss with your group which of these 4 stories. We heard about Boris Johnson visiting Ukraine. We heard about the possibility, we also heard the first story just about Ukraine. The third story was about the possibility of the US overturning abortion law, as was predicted by you guys earlier. And then we have the Met Gala celebration in the US. So you're going to discuss in your group which story you think is most important or most interesting and why. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for this to kind of mimic group work. And I will give you 5 minutes in this, and I'm going to change up the rooms a little bit. Okay, I'll go ahead and open the rooms. You have 5 minutes to discuss which news story is either the most interesting or most important and why.
Hi, Mina.
Hi, hang on. Everyone is not back from the breakout rooms yet. And actually, we're not going to discuss this. Hopefully you had some good discussions in your room, but because of time, we are actually not going to discuss this because we're going to discuss the actual lesson. But hopefully you had some good, interesting discussions. Okay, so you are no longer students. You are now professional teachers. You just kind of experienced a sample listening lesson. So what you're going to do now is you're going to analyze the lesson that you just had. So I have 4 questions here for you. What type of listening did you do in your lesson? Did you use real world skills in your listening? What language skills did you use in this lesson? Listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And question number 4, were you able to make a personal connection to what you were listening to? So I'm actually going to put you back in breakout rooms. I'm going to change the breakout rooms so that you are working with different people. But we're now going to analyze this lesson. Sorry, I got you all excited with your political discussions and discussion about news. But actually, we're going to focus back on the lesson itself. I'm going to give 4 minutes in the breakout room to answer these 4 questions. This slide will be up here. And then if you are having trouble seeing the types of listening, I've put in the WhatsApp groups, I've put an image showing the types of listening. And I would say, number 1, that question is the least important. If you get stuck on question number 1, just move on. I think questions 2, 3, and 4 are actually more important questions than question number 1. So in your breakout rooms, you're going to now analyze the listening lesson. You'll be in there for 4 minutes. I'll see you soon. All right, so let's discuss these questions. I'm actually going to leave question number 1, unless somebody really wants to answer question number 1. Nancy, I saw your hand was up. What would you like to share with us? Do you want to answer one of these questions?
Yes, I would love to answer question 1.
Okay.
So I was in room 1. I don't know, I'm not sure. What type of listening did you do? So for us, we said the listening was responsive because we were listening to a piece of news, and then we were looking at the context, and then what exactly was being talked about, and then we were now making a response where we were put into groups, and now we were responding, what did you hear exactly, and why was it interesting? Also, we say that it was selective because at some point, a member of the group was sharing that they were finding it difficult. There was this news about Met Gala, and he found it quite interesting, and so he kept on. He was quite like selective on concentrating on that particular news. Also, there was this also member who have shared that. The pronunciation of this reporter was not so familiar, so they had to rely on the subheadings or the short descriptions that were coming so that they can understand what exactly was being talked about. Yeah.
Very good. That's a great answer. Thank you. Does anyone want to add to Nancy's answer? Or do you all 100% agree? There was some good analysis on that team's part. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump in here. I would say you did all of these types of listenings in different parts. The responsive listening, when you were listening to the BBC article, I don't think that was responsive listening. However, in the warm-up, when you were in your groups discussing news, and when you were in the last activity where you were discussing which thing you thought was most interesting, this is responsive. You had to listen to each other and respond to each other. Nancy's absolutely right about the selective listening. You had to pick out specific content, especially on the first listen. In the first listen, you were to identify how many stories and what countries. Because you are all a high level
it was probably, you probably were doing more than selective listening, but for your learners, it would be a nice thing for them to know that's all they had to think about. And then finally, you are definitely doing extensive listening because you had to determine the general meaning in order to talk about which ones you thought were most important or most interesting. And as mentioned earlier, to do any of these, then you have to be able to do intensive listening. So basically, you were doing all of those things. That's a great point, Isaac. Yeah, so I think video can really help to support as well. This would be more difficult without any visuals and also less interesting. So that's one way that we can support our learners and also help keep them engaged. Let's go on to question number 2. In this lesson, did you use real world skills? Are any of these skills things that you would need to also use in the real world? You can answer in the chat or you can raise your hand. Go ahead, Lauren.
Yes, thank you so much. I think I've even used the real world skills. One I can mention is even active listening, which is part of listening, which we actually have to listen what is happening, and then we put ourselves in the shoes of these people to understand the situations. And then also these things like I was also acting critically to know like yeah, asking so many questions like what's happening here, why, there was a kind of critical thinking that was happening during the moment. And another last skill, the real world skill that I would mention is even to ask myself also if this is information, is it really happening or not happening? I was actually using some analytic skills to understand this is real or not. So if it might be fake news or true information, whatever, or if there is some part of the portions of the information that is probably left out, like having so many questions to ask, what is going to be next, or is there any other part of the story that is, that is there? So these are the things that I will be using.
Excellent. Those are great examples. Yes, and to add on to what Lorian said, listening to the news is not necessarily a skill, but it is a real world task, listening or watching. You also did some prediction about what would be there. That is a real world task. And then I know there was, especially room 1, some debating. That is a real world skill where we kind of not argue, but have a little bit of verbal jousting with people. Good. What language skills did you use in this lesson? I know we didn't actually do any of these, but if we did the whole lesson, which skills would you use in this lesson? Listening, speaking, reading, writing. You can use the chat or you can answer aloud. I hope you all use listening skills since it was a listening lesson. Yes, definitely. Good. Yes, very good. Listening, speaking, and writing were the main ones. A little bit of reading the questions, but yeah, reading was definitely not a major one. But yes, all 4 skills are used. Mainly listening, speaking, and writing. We didn't actually do the writing, but if we did the actual lesson. Very good. So we would say that this is an integrated skills lesson. And then finally, were you able to make a personal connection to what you were listening to or to the lesson? I'm guessing yes for a couple of reasons. Go ahead, Larian.
I can make it happen like when I make this story as mine, especially when Johnson was addressing to the parliament, Ukrainian parliament. I was like, if would I be me, and I'm like the prime minister in that moment, what should I do? What kind of speech should I give to to Ukrainian people because they are passing through horrible situations, and then like yeah, sometimes to speak to the people in trouble, it is not easy. So I was relating to this like if I would be me, what should I do?
Ah.
Yeah, that was like a connection I made. Like, or what if not there, but what if another situation that is I supposed to tell people I'm among them and they have a trouble and I don't have a way to support them to get out. So what should I do in the moment? Yeah.
Thanks, Larian. That's a very specific personal connection. So you were empathizing and sympathizing. Very good. I was thinking of something much more easier. Seth gave a resounding yes. Teresa was also empathetic with Ukraine because the war won't end soon. And Seth has strong feelings about Russia should stop invading. So my last question, which story was most interesting or important, was specifically designed to, even if you didn't already make a personal connection, a lot of you already were because you're adults and you care about what's happening in the world. But if you were my students, and sometimes students say, I don't care, but asking them to make a decision about what's most interesting or most important forces us to give our opinion and therefore make a personal connection. Go ahead, Seth.
Thank you, Mina. I was so much moved by what Boris Johnson was saying because, you know, lives are being lost, particularly innocent lives in Ukraine. That attack by Russia has really destroyed properties, resources. People have left homes. And, you know, it is to my personal feeling, it's like Russia does not care about the human life, the value of human life. And so I feel like this thing should stop and stop for once. Where diplomacy has failed, now there is need of the world, probably the friendly nations, the superpower, coming together to stop Russia against the invasion because it is really devastating Ukraine, particularly the lives of innocent citizens who are doing their business. Things have been stopped, people are refugees, and you know, there's a lot of suffering. So somebody somewhere should have a feeling and have an empathy for Ukraine. So this story by Boris Johnson, really, I felt like if I was in somebody's shoes who is able to do something, I'll move with speed and stop this war. Thank you.
Oh, I wish you were in charge, Seth. Thank you. Yeah, I could tell that a lot of you were making a personal connection. I knew Seth was because as soon as the breakout rooms finished, and not everyone had come back, but Seth's hand was already up, and I could see that he had strong feelings. I also saw in the chat that room 1 was having quite a debate, which shows that there's a strong connection. And yeah, because you are all adults, these news things do connect with us. Nancy is mentioning here that most of the topics are of world concern in one way or another, and they impact the rest of the world. The humanitarian crisis, celebrating arts, the abortion debate in the US, which affects funding for reproductive health worldwide. Isaac is also making a personal connection because it's mentioning it appeals to his beliefs about life starting at conception. Yeah, and so these stories themselves have a personal connection. And then we also had tasks that if we didn't already have a personal connection, were leading us to one. So this lesson was designed specifically in order to highlight best practices. So we started the lesson with a pre-task to engage you, to activate your background knowledge and establish context. So when we're doing a listening, we don't just say, okay, students, now we're going to listen and push play, or students, now we're going to listen and we open a book. We want to make sure that background information is activated. Studies have shown that how much background knowledge students have about a topic is actually the #1 predictor of how well they do on a listening task. So most of us have some kind of background knowledge, but we need to access it. So a pre-listening task helps us to access and think about what do we already know about this topic, and helps have some context. If we just suddenly push play and students don't know what they're about to hear, it can be very hard to make that adjustment. So we want to set it up for them. This lesson was also scaffolded to support learner success. It probably wasn't as apparent to you because you all have good listening skills, but we listened twice to the listening. First, to just identify how many stories in what countries, the second time to get further information. If this were a real class, we actually would have listened a third time so that we could check our answers as well. And so that brings us to the next best practice. Students need to listen multiple times, especially in the beginning. In real life, we usually don't get to listen multiple times. For example, if we're in a lecture and a professor is lecturing, we can't say, oh, excuse me, teacher, I wasn't listening. Can you please say everything again? But in real life, we often can ask questions and get the main information back that we need. But as learners are first starting out, we want to give them multiple chances. And then we also want to have, after the main listening, we want to have some sort of post-listening activity that promotes interaction and engagement. So the last activity we did, you were in your breakout rooms talking about which stories were most important or interesting to you. This was so that you would have a chance to talk to each other and have interaction, because we don't want to have a lesson where students are just passively listening. We want to engage with what we're hearing. And so I wanted you to have be able to make a personal connection. Lorian, that's an excellent question. Scaffolding is basically the steps we do to support our learners. If they can do this, then they can do this. If they can do this, then they can do this. So if learners can identify how many stories in what country, then they have some solid footing. Now they can begin to understand what's happening in each of these stories. We scaffold learning in general. If students can, if they can understand the alphabet, then they can begin to understand words. If they can begin to understand words, they can begin to understand sentences. If they can begin to understand sentences, they can begin to understand discourse. So that kind of step-up process. I'm glad you asked that. Maybe we should have a session on scaffolding. It does go with Bloom's taxonomy. We don't have to think about it that way, but Bloom's taxonomy is scaffold. In order to understand something, we have to remember it. If we can understand it, then we can apply it. If we can apply it, then we can begin to analyze, create, and evaluate. Those are great questions. Yeah. All right, and then finally, we want to use an integrated skills approach as much as possible. We don't want to have a lesson where students only listen. They should have at least one other skill, either, well, hopefully speaking, because those are the two things that go together. But we want to have an integrated skills approach because life is an integrated skills approach. In life, we never just use one skill. We're always using multiple skills at a time. So in terms of assessment, we want to be careful and consider what type of listening we want to assess. We want to use an integrated approach if we can, as that is the most authentic approach, but we also want to be careful for some of the reasons that were mentioned earlier. For example, Seth was saying if they have poor vocabulary, then maybe they can't explain. So maybe for students with a low level of vocabulary, especially beginners, retelling the story or summarizing is not a great way to assess listening because they don't have the vocabulary. So if you remember earlier, there was an example where they could draw the story. So that would allow them, of course, we're not assessing their drawing skills, but showing that they understood what they heard. When possible, we want to incorporate authentic passages. Students aren't always ready for authentic listening, but we want to have authentic tasks, the kind of things we would do in real life. For example, in real life, we don't do multiple choice. It doesn't mean multiple choice can't be part of an assessment, but we want to also do something that's more like what we do in real life. And even in assessment, we want to make sure that we provide context before they listen and that we encourage a connection. So even if students are listening to something and they answer with multiple choice questions, we want to let students know what they're going to be listening to first, and then after ask them some sort of an opinion question where they get a chance to make a connection to what they hear. In terms of resources, there's many things out there on the internet. And here I'm just highlighting these first two that I have here. The first is a bunch of audiobooks. So this can be a great way to incorporate reading skills and listening skills. They're available for free, and there's actually also some lesson plans that go with these audiobooks. The next one is actually one of my favorite for lower level exercises. They're different conversations. They're beginner, intermediate, and advanced, and they come with listening comprehension questions. Even if you don't use them in class, if you have students who need to work on their listening outside of class, this would be a great website to recommend. The next one is Voice of America. There's a regular Voice of America that is actually authentic regular listening, but there's also a learning English version of Voice of America that makes the listening, they have a beginner and intermediate level. It comes with glossaries and scripts, so students can also read what they hear. And then two authentic sources would be TED Talks for higher level students. It does come with subtitles, and a lot of them actually come with lesson plans as well. And then one of my favorite websites is this, I believe. It's personal essays on all different topics and themes written by some famous people, but also some regular people. I like this for writing courses, reading, and also listening. They can hear the writer actually read their own essay, and they can read it as well. If you end up using any of these, I would love to know what you did with them. These are just a few. So we won't be meeting on Thursday, just a reminder. I'll be seeing you next Tuesday, and this is the schedule for the rest of the month. Depending on the results from the Google form that Austin shared with you, we'll decide about the June and July schedule as well, what topics will be on there. But this is what's coming up. I'm already starting to think that June will be devoted to writing based on the answers you gave in our last session. In the poll I gave, there was a lot of interest in different types of writing. Also, if any of you have your own ideas or practices to share, something you've done in your classroom that works really well, an article you read about that you want to share, something that you had an issue with and solved and you want to share your best practice. We've had a few of you come forward and share. It's a great way to get some practice and also to give back to this excellent group. And if you can't wait until Tuesday to meet again, you are welcome to join us on Friday. Rukia Mohammed heads this EMCG group. It is university students, but also teachers. We're having a belated Earth Day celebration. Earth Day was April 22nd, but it's never too late to celebrate the Earth. So we'll have a short presentation, some exercises, some discussion, and we might be having a special guest join us as well. So if you're free on Friday evening, you're welcome to join us for that as well. All right, I think that wraps it up. If anybody has any last minute questions or comments before we wrap this up tonight. Of course, I will put this PowerPoint into the WhatsApp. So if there's any links that you didn't catch, you'll be able to catch them in the PowerPoint. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for your participation. Thanks, Lorian. No, teaching listening is not that easy. You're absolutely right. Actually, that should be our final point. Teaching listening is not easy. We cannot like go in and open our students' ears and joggle their brains, but we can help lead them to some of the strategies and motivate them to have interest, keep their attention, and structure these lessons. All right, I'm gonna head out because my husband made dinner and it is ready. So I'm gonna go and eat. I hope you all have a great night. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for your
Thank
great
you.
participation. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.